Yokoya is a lonely outcast who still longs for his mother, who left to get some milk and never returned. His mundane life takes a drastic turn when an assassin disguised as a maid appears at his doorstep, asking him to hire her as his servant. It was just another lazy afternoon for Yokoya, sleeping until noon, when his doorbell suddenly rang. Begrudgingly, he got up to check the security camera and saw a maid standing outside, one who eerily resembled an emo version of Violet Evergarden. She politely requested that he employ her as his maid. Curious but cautious, Yokoya let her in, offered her a drink, and tried to figure out her real intentions. In his head, he considered two possibilities. Either she was here to steal his kidneys, or she was about to sell him some suspicious white powder. Trying to keep things civil, he asked about her previous work experience as a maid. However, instead of answering directly, she casually revealed that she was once an assassin, eliminating people who opposed her master, the same person who had sent her here. At first, Yokoya thought she was joking, but as the realization set in that she was completely serious, unease crept up his spine. He hesitantly asked about her master and their connection to his family. In response, she launched into a bizarre explanation about how her master once had a goldfish that gave birth to a dog, which somehow lived for Nemo, and the dog's owner was a friend of Yokoya's mother. Frustrated by the absurdity of her response, Yokoya instinctively slapped her hand away, but the moment he did, he froze. He might have just angered a trained assassin. Quickly he tried to change the subject, asking about her preferred method of assassination. To demonstrate, she led him outside, pulled out a set of knives, performed a flawless backflip, and then launched the knives with pinpoint accuracy into a tree. Proudly, she explained that knife throwing was just one of the many deadly skills in her arsenal. Despite witnessing her incredible abilities, Yokoya ultimately decided he couldn't hire a female version of John Wick as his personal maid. Though disappointed, she accepted his decision with grace, apologized for wasting his time, and turned to leave. As she stepped through the door, Yokoya collapsed to his knees, struggling to process what had just happened. But as he looked down, he noticed something. Meanwhile, the maid wandered aimlessly, lost in thought about what she should do next. She glanced back, half expecting Yokoya to chase after her, but disappointment washed over her when she saw no one. As she reached the train tracks, a sudden voice shattered her thoughts. "Wait!" Yokoya shouted, running toward her with a small bell in his hand. "You forgot this." Before she could react, a train was speeding toward him. Her instincts took over. Rage fueled her movements as she launched forward, grabbing him just in time to yank him out of harm's way. For a moment, everything was still. The adrenaline faded, and as she looked at him, a faint blush dusted her cheeks. Yokoya, still catching his breath, thanked her for saving him. Flustered, she stammered, I don't usually save people. My heart is beating so fast." He smiled and held out the bell. "Here, you left this behind." She hesitated for a second before accepting it with a quiet, "Thank you." Then she turned away again, preparing to leave. But as she walked off, Yokoya's mind raced. An assassin maid had just saved his life. Maybe he needed someone like her around after all. "Wait," he called again. "Actually, I could use some help cleaning back home." Back at his place, Yokoya watched in disbelief as she unpacked an absurd number of knives. His expression twisted in horror as she casually rambled about how her blades could have prevented the rumbling. Wait, he cut her off. "I need you to clean my trash, not clean the streets of criminals with daddy issues." But she seemed confused. "So, not disposing of corpses?" Yokoya buried his face in his hands. I just need a housekeeper." The maid tilted her head. "So, you'll hire me as long as I do household chores?" He sighed. "Yes." Later that day, Yokoya returned home, only to find the place in complete chaos. Water covered the floors, furniture was misplaced, and the maid stood there, completely soaked, clutching a broken mop. A bucket was somehow stuck on her head. I'm sorry," she stammered, bowing repeatedly. But before he could respond, she suddenly lost her balance, only to flip mid-air and land perfectly like Spider-Man, with the bucket still smacking her head. Yokoya stared. "Wait, are you actually clumsy?" The maid, now red-faced with shame, kept apologizing. Sighing, he gently removed the bucket from her head and handed her a towel. "It's fine. You can start learning now. I'll help you." She looked up, eyes wide, before nodding cutely. Hours later, the house was spotless. Yokoya crossed his arms, nodding in approval. "Not bad. You did great." Her face lit up at the praise. But then Yokoya glanced at the clock and his stomach growled. "All right," he muttered. "Guess it's time for dinner." As they finished cleaning, Yokoya glanced at the maid and asked, "Can you cook?" She lowered her head, looking like a guilty puppy. Sensing her hesitation, Yokoya chuckled. "It's fine. Handle the cooking. You can go take a bath." The maid nodded and headed toward the bathroom. As she submerged herself in the warm water, she found herself thinking about Yokoya, her cheeks flushing as her thoughts wandered. Meanwhile, outside, Yokoya paced around the kitchen, muttering to himself. His mind was a mess. A deadly, emo assassin maid was bathing just meters away from him, and he had no idea how to process that. The thought of her stepping out in just a towel made his face heat up. But when she finally emerged, fully dressed in her usual uniform, all his expectations crumbled into disappointment. Suppressing a sigh, Yokoya turned his attention to dinner. He handed her a knife and warned her to be careful, but the maid confidently began chopping cabbage, except she sliced through it with the precision of someone cutting through human flesh. Yokoya raised an eyebrow but chose not to comment. Instead, he pulled out some instant ramen and fried pork. Seeing her puzzled expression, he asked, "You don't know what fried pork is?" She tilted her head. "I might have eaten it before, but I've never really paid attention to food." She explained that eating was merely a necessity, just fuel to keep her body functioning. Flavor never mattered to her. Yokoya, horrified by such a thought, smirked. "One bite of this fried pork and I guarantee you'll be making sounds like you're in food wars." Confident in his so-called discount gourmet meal, he plated 2 portions, one for himself and one for the maid. But just as they were about to dig in, he realized something. "I don't even know your name," he admitted. The maid blinked. "I don't have one. My master usually gives me one." For a moment, Yokoya considered naming her something ridiculous like Big Steve 9000, but he decided to wait until he found something more fitting. With that, they started eating. The moment she took her first bite of the fried pork, she paused. The taste, warm, rich, flavorful, was unfamiliar to her. She had never truly understood what delicious meant. A distant, buried memory flickered in her mind, shadows of a darker past. But for the first time, instead of cold emptiness, she felt warmth. Looking up at Yokoya, she quietly said, "Your meat tastes good." Yokoya, completely missing the double meaning, grinned. She hesitated before adding, "Both the food and you. You feel warm." But he didn't hear her. Instead, he stood up and gestured toward the hallway. "I've prepared a room for you to stay in." Leading her inside, he proudly stated, "I made it just for you." As she took in the sight, another memory surfaced, a much darker one. Blood. So much blood. But unlike those times, she wanted this new master to treat her with care. Yokoya noticed that unlike his, the maid's pork didn't have any sauce. Without a second thought, he handed her the bottle. "Try it with this." She drizzled the sauce onto her pork and took a hesitant bite. The moment the rich umami flavor hit her tongue, she let out an uncontrollable squeal of delight, praising the almighty tonkatsu sauce like it was a divine blessing. Later that night, Yokoya woke up in a cold sweat, tears clinging to his lashes. Another nightmare. Groaning, he rubbed his face and sat up, but before he could process the lingering fear, his stomach growled loudly. Screw it, he needed food. Yawning, he made his way toward the kitchen, only to hear an unexpected noise inside. He froze. Was that the maid? His half-asleep brain immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario. Is she plotting something? Slowly, he peeked inside. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. There, in the dimly lit kitchen, was the maid, crouched in front of the fridge, guiltily snacking on tonkatsu sauce straight from the bottle. For a long, awkward moment, they just stared at each other. Finally, she swallowed and tried to explain. I think I've become addicted to sauce." Yokoya, still processing what he was seeing, sighed. "It's fine. Are you hungry too?" She nodded hesitantly. With that, Yokoya whipped up some late-night snacks, extra saucy of course. As they ate together, she genuinely seemed to enjoy every bite, savoring the flavors in a way she never had before. Between bites, she suddenly asked, "Do you have nightmares often?" Yokoya hesitated. "Yeah." She tilted her head. "I heard someone talking in their sleep earlier. I thought an assassin had broken into your room, so I grabbed my knives and went in." Yokoya nearly choked. "Wait, what?" Ignoring his reaction, she continued, "But instead of an enemy, I found you sleeping. You had tears in your eyes." Yokoya's face burned with embarrassment. "You saw that?" The maid nodded. "You were calling out for your mother in your sleep." If embarrassment could kill, Yokoya would have dropped dead on the spot. Sensing his discomfort, she quickly tried to cheer him up. "I had a dream too, you know." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Yes. In my dream, the tonkatsu sauce spoke to me." Yokoya stared at her, completely lost. "Huh?" "It told me I could lick all the sauce I wanted, and that it would stuff me up." Yokoya choked on his food. "The hell?" She sighed. "But before I could lick anything, I woke up." Shaking off the absurdity of her dream, she admitted, "But it was the first time I dreamed of something other than assassinations. For once, I wanted to stay asleep." She glanced at him, looking genuinely concerned. "But you had a nightmare instead, and I couldn't comfort you." Yokoya hesitated before finally admitting, "It's always the same dream. My mum leaving me for some new daddy. And if I wake up without lying on her lap, I start crying." The room went silent. Then without a word, the maid gently patted her lap. "You can use mine," she offered. Yokoya's eyes widened. "Huh? No way!" Her expression faltered slightly. She looked down, feeling dejected. "I see. I guess I'm only good at taking lives, not comforting them." Seeing her like that made something in Yokoya crack. With a sigh, he gave in, hesitantly lying down on her lap. She stiffened in surprise, but then warmth spread between them. Yokoya looked up at her face, only to realize she was already looking down at him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither of them spoke. Slowly, he closed his eyes, resting against her warmth. Meanwhile, in her mind, she wondered, why does this feel nice?